heard.
All right, we are going public.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Those of you that are out there in our vast internet audience, thank you for being here. We, as a group, met last Thursday and had a wonderful discussion, and we wanted to share some of what we discussed about with you, learn a little bit more about each other, where we can go in this time where people have a lot of anxiety and concern. So let me get started by introducing the players here, and then we'll start. So we have Representative Brady Brammer, who's here with us, and will share some thoughts. He made an insight, by the way, at our Thursday meeting that I thought was profound. He made a point that laws don't change heart, and a lot of times we clamor for changes in laws, but what really has to happen is our hearts need to change. And so again, that's what this conversation is about. Nicki Rime is here. She's the one that launched this. So last Tuesday, she met me in the hall out here in City Hall and said, you know, I think we should have a conversation, and I know this guy, his name is Ronell, great guy, he coaches my soccer kids, and I think we should initiate a conversation. He has some wonderful ideas. And then we had a council meeting last night. That night, talked to Chief, met on Thursday, and now we're here, and it's because she followed her heart and made a comment and got the ball rolling. So thank you for doing that. We have Chief Brian Gwilliam here. He's a wonderful chief, and I appreciate working with him. Ronell Hugh is here. He works at Adobe. He was lightning fast as a youth growing up. He could have gone the professional soccer, rugby route, but he chose to be academic. We're glad he did, because we didn't want him over in England playing for Manchester. We wanted him here playing for Highland and Adobe. We have Alpine City Mayor Troy Stout here. I talked with him after our meeting and told him about what we did, and he got really, really excited. He wants to be part of this. He grew up, had some interesting experiences I hope he'll share with us as part of our conversation, and I'm excited to have him. We share the same police force, so I think it's very appropriate that we all discuss together. And I'm Rod Mann, Mayor of Highland City, and tonight normally would be my night that I entitle Meet with the Mayor, for people to come and meet and talk about anything. So tonight, we're changing that a little bit. We're going to talk about racial bias. And sometimes it's not a comfortable thing to talk about, but it exists. All kinds of biases exist, but this is one that is particularly poisonous. And a lot of it, I think, is just unconscious. So I would like to start and have Ronell talk about his experiences and share with us his experience in Highland, prior life, experiences as kids and his wife, and then we'll follow that up with the chief, talking about his perspective, what they're doing, and maybe answer some questions that have been asked over the last week or two. And during that time, we're all free to engage, and we actually came up with some really, I think, interesting ideas. How do we make this something that's sustainable and that actually changes hearts? And I'll let that come out later on in the conversation, but I am extremely excited. And it came out of a group discussion, and so I don't know that you can attribute to anybody specifically, but it was just a kind of a great thing that all worked together. So Ronell, tell us about yourself and where you came from, and I don't know, like where do you actually come from?
That's actually a good question, actually, because my wife always laughs when people ask that question. So Ronell, my name is Ronell, and I actually grew up all over. So when Mary Mann asked where I come from, actually if I were to speak from a genealogy or family history standpoint, I have actually Chinese, Syrian, Nigerian, Ghanaian, and Scottish, and a plethora of other countries that are part of my background. But I actually grew up in Germany, and lived in Germany in a small town west of Frankfurt. And it was, when I say small, there's about 253 people, and I know that's an exact number, but that's because that's literally how many people live in this town. And there may be like 60 homes in this town. But that's where I grew up, and so it was just me and my family, family of 6, actually family of 7, my parents, actually family of 6. My sister wasn't born yet. She was born in North Carolina, so it was a family of 6. And it was an interesting experience growing up. And then I lived in 3 different countries. So Germany, the United States, and then England, and back to the United States. And my journey in regards to the topic tonight has been one that's been just a lifelong journey. And it's something that I have experienced and have seen in my life in multiple locations. And one of the things that always stood out to me is when I first moved from Germany to the US was actually the first time I experienced a racial bias. And you think about that in context of the history of Germany and with Hitler and all that took place there, I never felt that when I lived in this small town, and my family was the only black family in this small town that we grew up in. Maybe partially because I spoke German, I speak fluent German, and so that always helps. But what the first experience I had with racism growing up as a child was one day, my mom had sent me out, as typical, to go and get the mail. I remember walking down our pebbled driveway to the end of the road, to the end of the driveway to get the mailbox, and I got to the mailbox and I looked on the side and there was a sticker with 3 letters on it. And it was a KKK sticker. And it was the first time I'd ever seen that, and I ran back into my house with the mail and gave it to my mom and said, there's a sticker with KKK on it. And I literally, to this day, can see the expression on her face of her, the fear, the worry, and the anger that came over her just because of hearing that there was a sticker on her mailbox. And that was my first introduction to racism. And I was probably somewhere in the ages of 8 and 9 at that point. So as a little kid, you kind of grow up thinking like, well, I grew up in Germany. I was like, everybody's nice. People, like, nobody cares about what I look like, But that was my first introduction. And since then, I've had a lot of different experiences. Living here in Highland, we moved here. So just a little quick background. I went to school at BYU, well, a lot of different schools, but got my bachelor's from BYU, and then actually came back and did my MBA at BYU. And then since then, we've moved. So we lived in Provo. We moved to Arkansas, where I worked for Walmart corporate there. And then I moved in Seattle, where I worked for Xbox. And then we moved back here about 3.5 years ago. And we were here, when we first moved here, we live over in the Canterbury neighborhood over in Highland. And that 2017, the week of Martin Luther King week, we always as a family will sit down and talk about Martin Luther King. So I remember this experience distinctively. And when you have kids, you start to realize, I can handle what this is, but then I worry about my kids. And my daughter, who was 6 at the time, I remember sitting down with her on a Wednesday and asking her, how was your day? Tell me about your day. What did you experience? And she began to tell me that, during recess, that some kid came over to her and said to her that black people were ugly. And for me as a father, I was just, I was enraged a little bit. I was upset. But then I was also worried because this is my daughter who's very, very like, I don't care if you're a boy or a girl, you're going to get what's coming to you. So I was a little worried that she might have done something. But she didn't. She turned around and said to this young man, don't judge me by my color, judge me by how I act. And as a father, that made me proud. But the fact, at 6 years old, now we wish she can be that composed with us as her parents, but she's, that's a different story.
Well, that was here in Highland.
That was here in Highland, right, at the elementary school where she goes to. And it was, as a father, you just kind of think about that and think, well, wow, my kids, I have to prepare them. Like their innocence is taken away because I want to believe that they can grow up in an environment where they don't have to face that, where they don't have to experience that type of, and the thing that I've always known and learned, and it can be debated back and forth, but that's not something you learn on the streets. It's learned in a home, right? It's learned and taught, and it's something that comes from people expressing those types of feelings and sentiments in their home. And so my 6-year-old had that experience, and you go from there as a father when you say, okay, what do I need to do for my kids so they understand what could potentially happen, especially considering, and we love where we live, but I want them to be prepared. So fast forward to where we're at today. There's been several experiences. I remember just recently with the Ahmaud Arbery case, hearing about what happened to him, where he was running, and and how he was, as we say in the black community, how he was lynched. The modern day lynching is what we refer to it as. I remember just doing a post on social media about, I like running, I run a lot, but then I said, here's the things I have to think about. And I started listing off the things. I have to make sure I'm wearing the right apparel because I don't want it to be seen or seen as me not being out for a run. Or I can't wear a hoodie because I don't want people thinking that I'm out doing something wrong. I can't go into homes that are being built because I don't want the perception that I'm in there to do something wrong. right? And I listed off all these things that I literally thought of on my run that day. And it kind of started this chain of like conversation with my friends, but then you go from that experience to Miss Taylor, who was killed, to Christian Cooper, who was in a park in New York City, and then to George Floyd. Those all kind of happened over a period of weeks, and we are where we are today. But that experience just recently for me was like, people are like, you really have to think that way? I was like, well, this is just today, but that's based upon what just happened. And I also live in a community where, I've had experiences. I belong to the predominant faith here, and there's been experience I've had as a part of the predominant faith where, I've approached somebody's door to give them materials because I had a role in the stake that I lived in, and I could see the fear in their face when they came to the door when they saw a black person at the door. And I had to quickly state to them what my role was in my religion to ease their concern and fear. Right, because they saw somebody who was unfamiliar to them, and they saw, and that's what I think it's my skin color. But when I said who I was and what I was there to do and what my position in my religious responsibility was, I could totally see them exhale and say like, oh.
I think,
one of us.
Yeah.
not speaking as a police officer, but speaking as a white Caucasian male, the conversation we've had previously and this one tonight, those are types of things that I have never had to think about. I think about you having to not walk onto property that's being built or under construction, and I find myself doing that, looking at houses and house plans all the time, just because I want to see, right? I want to see what's different, but I've never even thought about what the perception might be for you if you were to walk on that property.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of things that I've thought about over the last week in the discussions that we've had that I would never even have considered had we not had that conversation.
Yeah.
So I think it's wise for us to sit down and have conversations and talk to each other so we can experience and know what each other live and how things are. This is how we bridge gaps.
I agree.
Yeah, I put myself in your shoes and getting ready for work every morning, having to go through a checklist of things boxes I have to check to make sure I fit in the way people want me to fit in so that I feel safe.
Yeah.
I can't imagine going through that every day and feeling like I've got to make sure that if I don't check every box, I could run into trouble that day. It's no way to live, and I think it's insightful for you to share that with people, because I think until we put ourselves in that position, we can't fully understand it.
Yeah.
So would you get up and do your mountain bike riding?
Yeah, I can go anywhere I want. I don't worry about any of that. I walk into construction projects all the time, and I don't feel like sometimes I feel, oh, I hope the owner's okay with this, but I don't feel like I would actually be in danger. And that's something I take for granted on a daily basis. I live comfortably knowing that I'm okay when I do that, and it disturbs me to know that everybody doesn't feel that way.
Yeah. And it's interesting what you bring up, just to kind of hit on this. I think often we hear in this conversation, which sometimes is uncomfortable for a lot of my white friends and people that I know that are white, is like the idea of white privilege, and that's what that is.
Yeah.
That's what's meant by that idea, is because typically you don't have to think about those things, right? And so I know that term can be offensive sometimes. And so for me, I actually rarely say it. My wife says it actually probably more than I do, but she's also white, so she gets different looks when she says it. but she does say it. But it's that idea that, hey, these are things that you don't have to think about. Yeah. It doesn't have to go through your mind to make sure that it matters. And so it actually is interesting. I get the compliment a lot. When I was in business school, people would say, would you actually be the fashion coordinator, so to speak, for my spouse, their husband, because I dress really nice. And part of that is I do like apparel, but part of that has been I want to make sure I present myself in a nice way, so it's not off-putting to people. Yeah. So it's actually more inviting to people to help them to feel comfortable, right? But it's part of who I am now too, so I like it. But
so I've worked as a police officer in this community for 25 years, and it's interesting that not on occasion, but more often than not, we have solicitors, that's what you call them, that come in from outside of the state, that come in to sell and go door to door. We get calls, especially during the summer, that there's a suspicious male that's walking down the street. And when we ask the individual what are they doing that makes them suspicious, it turns out to be the color of their skin. Yeah. They're a black male.
Yeah.
And you know, that's not meant to be offensive to anybody, but those are the calls that we get every summer, all summer long, when those kind of things are going on. And so when you talk about white privilege, we get phone calls for illegal solicitors, but we don't get phone calls for suspicious individuals or suspicious males if they're white.
Yeah.
We do if they're black.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's very interesting that you talk about that, because we see it as police officers that even in a community like this where we all think that we're accepting and we don't have bias, if you will, but you know, I'm sure we're going to talk about this, but implicit bias, everybody has them.
Yeah.
And it's something that we deal with all summer long. So.
No.
There's an emotional load to feeling like you have to assuage other people's concerns all the time. So what I would liken it to is, I don't know if you've ever been on a street where it's an empty street, it's at night, and there's a single female in front of you. And you think to yourself, I'm not going to get very close to her because she might feel threatened by someone behind her. And so you hold back so that she feels a little bit more comfortable that you're not someone up to no good with her.
Yeah.
And that creates, you know, if you're having to do that all the time, you know, that's a specific scenario. You know, but just to understand it a little bit,
Yeah.
you know, if you're having to do that all the time, that creates an emotional load that is very difficult. And, you know, another scenario that is difficult to describe that load is, you know, I refuse to drive the babysitter home because it might not look right. There might be something wrong.
Brady, you and I are on the same page with this one, right?
And I was like, driver, I got driven home, just drive.
She didn't understand for a long time why I refused to do it, and it was like a source of contention. I'm like, you don't get it. It just doesn't turn out good. Nothing good can come of this.
Yeah.
And you're going to have to do that every time. I will never do that for you. I'm sorry. I just won't do it. And, you know, it took a long time, and it actually took her talking to a lot of her friends that their husbands were refusing to do that as well, to get to the point where she was like, you know, this may be something real that that's behind this. It's not just my husband doesn't want to do something for me. Like, there's a reason for it. And it took a long time to get to understanding, and it took a lot of conversations, and that's kind of the hope here.
Yeah.
And those are trivial. Those are little things. I don't want those to be perceived in any way to be like equivalencies or anything like that, but just to help understand that situation and how difficult it is to understand the emotional load among all the numerous other things. It takes a lot of time and conversation.
So can I add to that? And this is, you know, when we talked earlier, Ronell, you just said the word, I'm just tired. I'm tired.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand where you were coming from up until these last couple of weeks, where there's been a lot of finger pointing and people are looking at law enforcement in a not so positive light, and it's a constant barrage. And I feel, and it's only been 2 weeks, understand this, but I'm tired. I'm tired of being the target of something that I haven't done personally, but I'm being painted with a broad brush. And there's a bias towards law enforcement right now, right, wrong, or indifferent. But when you say that, I can maybe a little bit understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
Again, it's only been 2 weeks, but I'm tired, and it is exhausting. So
Yeah.
I can't imagine having to do this and make those checklists every day. Not only as you walk out the door, but when you go into a store or you visit a club or you're taking your family on vacation. I couldn't imagine having to do that every day.
Yeah, it's actually something. So I wrote a letter. As Mayor Mann said, I work at Adobe, so I wrote a letter to all of our, a bunch of people in our company, and the subject line was, in quotation marks, "I'm tired and I can't breathe," and that was the subject line. And I kind of started to kind of both like, why am I tired? And it's and I said this, I talked about this last week when we met. This has been literally it's been 400 years and 9 months. And the only reason I did this, I did a timetable thing where I went back and put in the dates, and I actually figured out what day in August in 1619 actually was the day when it started, which was the 20th of August in 1619 that the first slave.
The first slave was brought.
First slave was brought to our shores in Virginia, and it's interesting when you think about that, like 400 years and 9 months, and I didn't live that long, of course, right? Like, I mean, if I did, I mean, I look be in pretty good shape, right? But like, I didn't live out. But to think about, for centuries, this has been the feeling and sentiment, right? Maybe I talked about how like laws can't change hearts. There's been a lot of laws or, enacted to help support some of this. Not specifically maybe race issues or blacks, but it helped in a lot of regards to that. But it didn't really change. It didn't really change the fabric, and I fully believe that the fabric of it is our hearts. And so when I talk about being tired, and when I wrote to my colleagues about being tired, it's exhausting. And you think about, for me, it's like, okay, I just want everybody to be scared, right? I don't want anybody to be fearful of me, and kind of, because that's just not my nature. I don't look at people who are any race or gender or ethnicity, like, it doesn't matter to me. They're just people. They're people who I want to get to know. And part of that stems from me moving to 3 different countries by the time I was 10, because I just became more curious about people in general. But the idea that you have to make sure, it's crazy to think, I'm protecting others' feelings.
Yeah.
Right? That's what I'm spending my time doing, is protecting their feelings so that they aren't fearful and scared, and so that then we can hopefully engage in a meaningful way. And sometimes you're tired because you don't feel like it's reciprocated. You feel like you're always the one that's like, okay, let me put myself out there to make sure that you're okay before we engage, so that we can actually engage, right? And it's overwhelming, but as a black man in America, that's part of the life that you live, and so it's just the norm, which is also crazy to think, but that's literally the norm. I just do it every day.
Well, and we've been friends for a couple of years while you've coached my daughter for
Yep.
soccer. And so as I started to hear your experiences as my friend, I didn't want that to happen to you. And I think sometimes in Highland we kind of get this feeling of, all is well in Highland. But the truth is,
Or Alpine.
Or Alpine, sorry.
All is better in Alpine.
But the truth is, you were having experiences, with the Ahmaud Arbery murder, like that affected you with thoughts of, now I need to change and be more careful. And then when the Michael Cooper experience happened in New York in Central Park, same thing. I remember you shared a story with us of kind of a situation that happened at a soccer field that you had rented, and a woman was claiming,
Yeah.
you can't be here. And, if you, and maybe you should share that, but,
Yeah.
but I guess where I'm going is, as your friend, I've never thought about that before, and I've always felt like I love my friends that are of color. I love having friends that are diverse, but there is more that we need to do in Highland and in Alpine, and I want to do something, and watching the news nationally, it breaks my heart what's going on nationally, but we can change things here in our city, and it happens by talking to the people that are affected and then working together to help that. But I can't change what's happening in Minnesota. I can pray for those people, but if everybody just worked with their own local leadership, their neighbors, and we just talk, we have these conversations, that's how we're going to change. But it starts small.
Yeah.
It starts small all over the place. So I'll turn it back over
Yeah.
to you so that you can share, like these current events, like, they're not just far away. They're
here,
in
yeah.
towns.
And I'll share two, I guess, that kind of ring home, because the first one is running. When I first actually moved here, so I ruptured my Achilles, which was sad because I used to play basketball a lot, but I ruptured my Achilles a month after we moved into our home, maybe 23 weeks after we moved into our home. So it was wintertime, and so my poor wife and kids had to take care of me.
That's the worst.
But when I got back to running, I remember maybe the first week or so I was running, I started running down 10300 here in Highland, and I remember a truck passing me. And it was distinctive for me because the truck had 2 flags. And one was an American flag and one was a Confederate flag. And if you've watched any news or read anything in the news recently, you can see a lot of Confederate things coming down. And it may be interesting, but it means something different to me. And so when I was running that day, I remember just like having to think to myself, I needed to turn and watch the truck just to make sure, because it was at a point in the day, in the morning, where it was light enough that you could see the color of my skin. And I my thought was like, well, turn and make sure that they don't turn around or try to run you over or try to do anything. And it's interesting because that's like, again, it's kind of my mental mode of like, I don't think everybody's going to hurt me, but when I see the flag, that flag signals something to me.
It's like when you found the sticker on your mailbox.
Yeah.
It's a sign that somebody thinks differently
Yeah.
about you because of the color of your
Yeah.
skin.
And now the interesting that we talked about, I remember talking about this last week, like, you know, maybe people don't think probably don't know really what that flag means, or maybe they do, right? It's a balance of giving people the benefit of the doubt, right? But I'm like, the signal for me is something completely different. I don't care what their perception of the flag is. For me, it means one thing.
There's a message there.
There's a message there, right? And so it's interesting. There's always those little moments. And then the other one that Nick was talking about was I rent the Mitchell Hollow soccer field, and so and for about a 2-year period, I continued to have a conversation with another coach who would just show up and try to take the field and kind of use it. But I was like, hey, I'm going to follow the laws of Highland, which is like, hey, you should rent the fields if you're going to use it for soccer. And I'm like, I'm just going to do that. And it became this issue of where I had to constantly have a conversation about, can you leave the field so I can practice? And I realized at some point, I was like, I don't want to be put on the end of being the black man in the neighborhood who somebody calls and says this person is harassing me. So it's the Amy Michael Cooper situation in New York, where it's like, hey, this could happen to me. So I actually called, the police, and they came, and they were probably surprised, but I called them. But I was like, listen, I rent the field. I don't want to have anything happen where I'm accused, of something being done or said or happening. And at me as a black person, I know how this ends up, right? And it sounds crazy, but I mean, all I can speak for, and not to put the Lone Peak police under any pressure, but it's like, I can only speak from experiences that I've seen and experienced by other black men and women, right? So that my natural thought was to call the police, and they were kind of shocked because I just said it blatantly. I'm just pretty, open. I was like, hey, I'm a black man in America, and I just want to make sure that I don't do anything that causes offense or gets me harmed in any way or puts me in jail. And so we just had that kind of short interaction, and then the woman left and the police officer left, and I was just like, okay, I can move forward. But it's kind of it gives you kind of a sense, I'm trying to protect myself.
You have to take the extra steps.
And make sure that I'm protecting myself in the way that I need to. So.
Well, and it's sad that that's there. And one of the things that we fight the most in Highland is the perception that it just isn't there, that racism is not here, and that some of that isn't here. And that's one of the important things to talk about, is that it is here. I mean, I send out candidate surveys prior to each legislative session to get feedback on what people want. Well, there were 5 or 6 that, a lot of it is kind of tied to illegal immigration because of the thing, but some of them have comments like, stop allowing Nigerians to come to America. And I'm shocked when I read it, and I'm like, wait, these are refugees running from a horrible, horrible situation. And we sponsor some refugee families and help them, and so we've kind of learned that story a little bit, so we have some sensitivity to it. But if you're watching this, we may only have a 1% black. In fact, today I got the demographics. They do a report each year for what our demographics are for my district, District 27, which is primarily Highland, Alpine, Cedar Hills, a little bit of Draper, a little bit of Pleasant Grove, and a little bit of American Fork. We have 95% white people in this district. We have 3% Hispanic, and then for some reason they count 6% of there's 6% of minorities, but I think they kind of round a couple of them up. So it's actually 5%. But they say that it's 1% African American, 1% Asian, 1% Pacific Islander, and 3% Hispanic or Latina. So there's not a huge population here, and a lot of our population they're in mixed race families. A lot, they're adopted children, but it's here. There's racism and there's bigotry, and it's here in Highland, and it's in Alpine, it's in this district.
Well, I think some people put a friendly spin on it, so they figured it isn't as bad. They're not overtly racist, but they're subtly racist, or they have make racial judgments based on not personal experience, but what they've heard, and they operate more carefully around those suppositions. And for me, there are a few questions that you have to ask yourself, I think. I ask myself, first is, what do I see first when I look at a person, anybody? When I meet somebody or just glance at them for the first time, do I see the color of their skin? Do I see their gender? Do I see how they're dressed? What am I looking at? And I think it would be useful for all of us to take a real hard look at that, to determine what we base our initial judgments on. and why we base those initial judgments. And the second question is, at what point in our lives did we learn to distinguish between color? And I had some childhood experiences around that, where I remember the first time I saw color. I was forced to see it by my parents, who were reacting to somebody I brought home with me in the second grade. And it kind of shook me, and I never felt right about it. And then the third question is, I think I hear a lot of people say, and I think to some degree it's true, that it's better than it used to be. You know, across America, well, the racial situation is better than it used to be. And maybe it is in some ways, but it's still not right. So the question is, when will it not only be better, but when will it be right? And who makes it right?
Yeah.
It comes from every individual, and really evaluating how they perceive other people based on race, religion, attire, or whatever that is, and forcing ourselves to put ourselves in the shoes of somebody who has to go through a checklist every day when they get ready for work or to go out running. And I think until we're capable of doing that for ourselves, we never will get it. We're never going to quite get there where we need to be.
And it starts with talking to people.
Yeah.
It just, because I can see a group of people and make a judgment about them, but it changes when I talk to one of them. And I have that happen time and time again in my life. Oh, you get to know them, and oh, you experienced this. You had to flee Vietnam, and it just changes you. And all of a sudden, they're not a thing anymore. They're a person, and it really doesn't. Nothing else really matters, but that they're a person. I don't see anything else anymore. Like now, when I talk to Ronell, I see Ronell. I don't see. I see a nice person. He's very articulate. He's passionate, and the color doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
Right? And I see the chief, and he's not an evil policeman. I know him. He's got a really good heart, and I know Brady, and he's not a wicked politician. He's a normal guy. He's passionate. And,
He's a lawyer.
That's strike two.
Yeah. But it happens when you meet people and talk with them.
Yeah.
And so I'm very appreciative that we're doing that tonight.
Yeah.
And you know, we're looking over here occasionally. Brianna is over here. She's a bit camera shy. That's Ronell's wife.
She's the best.
Yeah.
She's a really good person. She happens to be on our library board and is doing a good job. We want to thank her for that.
You know, can I jump in? I find it really interesting that these are all happening at the same time. You know, the riots and all of a sudden, you know, people are paying attention to this problem that we have addressing race and caring for each other that are of different colors. At the same time, we have coronavirus. I don't know what it's been like for you, but since we quarantined and you know so many businesses shut down, and there was a push to go to restaurants and support your small businesses, like I noticed that I started really looking in the eyes of the businesses, and it's like, are you okay? Like the restaurants that I go to, I look and be like, are you doing okay? Like, do we need more people to be supporting you, or the small businesses? And you know, I feel like that's exactly what we need to be doing with our friends and our neighbors all the time, but especially as we talk about, you know, our friends that are of color. You know, we need to look them in the eye and just say, are you okay, and what can I do? You know, we just need to have these kind of conversations. And I loved one of your comments that you made on Facebook where, and I may misquote you, but you were basically saying, I want you to make mistakes showing that you're trying.
Yeah.
You know, and we're all learning how to care for each other better, you know, no matter what our background is. But especially right now, like I hope we can reach out and say, you know, are you okay, and what can I do?
Yeah.
And this is what communities used to be about. You know, you used to know everybody that was in your town. You talked to everybody on your street. When we lived in LA, it was interesting. In our church, they would say, just go out and talk to your neighbors, because we don't do that enough anymore. And it's weird that we're at that place that we just don't go out enough and talk to our neighbors and ask them how they're doing. So, You know, these are simple things, just like coronavirus, when you are asked to wear a mask and social distance, and, you know, like, that's not a crazy demand. It's kind of like, here's a basic thing you can do, and here's a basic thing you can do, and we'll have huge results if we do those basic things.
It's interesting you say that, because when Police Chief William was talking about the suspicious characters in the neighborhood, so I met one of them the other day. He was walking through my neighborhood, you know, but it's interesting because he was walking through and I saw him and I said, you know, I always have this happen. So you say that typically, you know, black males here selling, and I tend to give them cash, right? And I don't care what they're selling. I'm like, I'm going to try to support them in any way I can. And I usually ask them how they're doing, how they're being treated. You know, and typically I get, hey, people have been pretty nice, right? And so that's what they say. But it's always interesting because I think, I don't know who they are, but I know, you know, that they're in an area where they probably don't see a lot of people that look like them. So when they see me, they're like, oh, there's one. And so then they're like, hey, and I'm usually like, they happened the other day, and I was like, well, let me go scrounge up what I need in terms of cash, because I don't pay with checks. We learned our lesson with not giving checks in those scenarios. But I give cash because I want to support. I'm like, hey, I don't know what they're going to use it for, and I'm going to believe that they're going to do something good with their life, but I want to be supportive. But I think to that point, like the opportunity to look at people and to see them, right? I think, you know, I do these presentations where I talk to different university students, and there's kind of this process, and I'm actually working on this thing now to help do with high school and maybe elementary kids. But it's all around how much time do we spend to that point getting to know people, right? You think about how much time we spend looking at differences and saying, well, this person must be this or they're this. And regardless of their history, yeah, you're going to have people who are criminals who may do bad things. I'm more optimistic and hoping that if I show optimism and positivity, that maybe those people will have more optimism for themselves. But it really, for me, has always started around how much time do we spend putting ourselves or exposing ourselves to cultures and people who aren't like us. And I'm not even talking about talking. I'm just saying, do you put yourself in a scenario where you can feel uncomfortable? Because trust me, you're always going to feel uncomfortable, to what you were saying, Nicki, about, hey, you're going to get it wrong. By the way, everybody will get it wrong. You're going to figure out, you're going to try to do something and try to help with the Black Lives Matter movement or something to that effect. And you're going to be like, well, I can't do anything right because I'm going to stop. Well, guess what? We have to get it wrong to get it right. You have to try something to get it right. And, you know, so again, putting yourself in a scenario where you can get, then the second is like, then have dialogue, start talking, start to understand that, not dialogue for the point of trying to prove yourself right, that you kind of, oh, I figured you out, now you're in this bucket. That's not the process, right? It doesn't really actually help either person or individual, because you're already starting to do the classification, right? I was telling a friend the other day who kind of emailed me about something. I was like, America has been doing classification from the beginning. And he's like, what do you mean? I was like, well, think about it this way. You have African American, you have Asian American, you have Mexican American. And now I know when you do forms now, they've changed that, but then you have Americans. As a black person and any probably other groups, you realize that what they mean by Americans must be white Americans. Yeah. Because there's no category or classification, right? And he's like, well, I never really thought about it that way. I'm like, well, if you look at the history, we've implied these things over years. Right? So the classification comes there. So when you're having dialogue, it's not to do that. It's just to sit there and say, okay, I'm trying to learn about you, trying to understand you. And that, in my mind, leads to what I refer to in the next phase of the equation is understanding. It's not understanding in the sense of like, oh, I figured you out so I can classify you, or I figured you out so I can't associate with you. It's more of like, I understand who you are. I spent time learning and understanding about you because I'm interested in who you are as a person, not to make sure that I can fulfill my ideas or notions of who I thought you were. And that to me is where we embrace. And that's what I've always thought. Like, you do all of that to embrace somebody, even though you may have differences, right? You may have every difference in the book, right? But the idea is that, no, I can literally, to what Mayor Mann was saying, like, hey, I can really just see this person and I can embrace them. And I think that's how we get through this. Like, I've had a lot of friends ask me, like, well, how do we move past this? I mean, and that's a bigger conversation because there's a lot of things that we have to do to move past this. It's not just like, okay, throw money at it or do whatever. Yeah. It actually takes a lot more. And what you're seeing now is just, it's like a volcano erupting. It's been building up for centuries and all of a sudden it just blew, right? But it's going to take a lot more. But I think those are easy steps. And those are steps that we all can do, you know, and those are steps we can do in our home by, you know, evangelizing that, so to speak, with our family and our friends and our kids. You know, things like this should never happen. Like, my wife and I were at a BYU football game, we were dating, and somebody said to her what we were doing was a sin. And if you live in this community and you're, you know, part of the dominant religion, think about that. Somebody dating somebody who's black, or if they're black and white dating you, calling that a sin, how does that work? How does that fit? How does that actually bring us together when that's the space in your mind that you're allowing and expressing it verbally, to others, right? And so I think that's how we start this, right? And if you're uncomfortable with that, if you're in a restaurant, maybe not the best place to approach somebody, but maybe if you're in a neighborhood, or maybe if you're in a grocery store and you're saying, hey, I just want to see how you're doing. I do that actually all the time. I'm actually fascinated. There's a lot of Indians from India in Utah now, right? So I always go up to them and say, hey, listen, I used to work at Microsoft, had a lot of Indian friends. Tell me why Utah. And it's not a hurtful question. It's just like, well, tell me why, and tell me where you're from. What do you like about it here? And it's an easy conversation. And it's just in a grocery store. It's not like there's none in my neighborhood, right?
In India, my last company, I ended up starting a company, or helping start a company with 6 Indians. And I joked with myself, I'm the token white guy, right? So we would go to India, and I would get treated different in India than Indians, because you had completely, I would pay twice as much for a hotel because I was not Indian, and my American guy that was with me, who was Indian, he'd get this room at half the price, and I said, I went, well, I want his room. No, you're, yeah, okay. But it happens everywhere.
Yeah.
And I find it kind of interesting in my life. A lot of my really, really, really good friends in the business world, they're very liberal, just off the charts liberal, and I am conservative. But we like each other, we talk, we're like really good friends, and we care about each other, but sometimes politics gets in the way. So we're talking about a specific problem, but we just need to learn to be more inclusive in general.
Yeah.
And this is a really good starting point, because you have a positive experience, and then it propagates. We had the riots in the 60s and the civil rights movement, and in the 70s, I had a race riot in my high school. And we've had ongoing things. We've had these eruptions, and we are making progress, but we shouldn't expect that, like, Brady can pass a law and tomorrow will all be better. It will be years, but we can start, and we can take a positive approach, and that's what I love about what's happening. And I think that would be a good time to start talking a bit about.
We've got a question.
Yeah.
Oh, we have a question. So let's take the question, and then I need to look at my phone, because the agreement was that she would text me questions. I will read my phone. Sorry. Question. Texted me a question.
While you're looking for that, I'll throw out that, you mentioned race riots that happened in your school. When I was growing up in Southern California, we had the Rodney King riots, and that was in front of me, and I was like, what? And I grew up, in a nice area of Southern California, but there was more diversity than here, and I just didn't know that there was such strong feelings. And from that time forward, where I lived, I was really blessed personally that my schools actually, they brought in kind of a motivational speaker named Phil Boyd. He had this program called Breaking Down the Walls, and it was a transformative experience for me, where he kind of came in and he had our high school students, and I don't remember if we did it by grades, but it was large groups, but small enough that they kind of walked us through these opportunities to feel empathy for other people, and they would ask us questions, and then if you felt that way too, you would walk across the gym, and then you would see all the people, they'd be like, have you ever felt, judged by your skin color? And some people walked across, and you'd just be like, wow, there were some Latinos, there were some white people, there were Polynesians, and then you'd walk back and everybody would start again. They'd ask another question, like, have you ever felt unfairly judged because of how much money your family makes? And in that question, it was fascinating, because almost everybody walked. The kids that lived in poor areas and the kids that lived in richer areas, and then all of a sudden they're standing on the same side of the gym, looking at each other, thinking, we both feel like we've been judged unfairly. And so really, we just need help remembering how to feel empathy and how to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And so, you know, sometimes these race riots happen, you know, to you, they happen in my lifetime, and I think they can be productive, and that's where we're trying to get. I think, you know, we're going to answer this question, and then we'll move on to what we can actually do, because I'm not one that's okay just talking about it. Like, it's just not worth it if we're just going to talk about it. So
It's time to be proactive and stop being reactive, and start changing based on what we want it to be like down the road, as opposed to what we're forced to adjust to because a riot broke out. I think it's important that we determine our destiny, and we shape it by shaping the way we think, the way our children think, and the way that our associates think. I responded to a post. I know we've got to get for a question, but there was a post last week, and it was, you know, it was challenging what we think about race. And my response was, you know, if we are friends and you feel that your color, your religion, your financial status, or your heritage makes you superior to anyone, then you and I are not friends. We're not the friends that you think we are, because I don't want to be associated with that pattern of thinking. We have to put ourselves in the humanistic form at its most basic level. You know, looking into each other's eyes and saying, "Are you okay?" and actually caring about how we are. And I think the language that we use in our homes, that our children hear, those things, they all have a ripple effect. And you know, going back to the question, when do we see color? At what stage in our lives do we recognize color? I think that's determined by what is said in the home, and to some degree what your experience is outside the home. But it's our responsibility to start shaping that at the earliest possible stage, that there is no difference in color.
So Chief, with respect to this, I'm
Yeah.
kind of going off topic,
Yeah.
but I imagine that there are lots of members of the community that are asked about what policies do you have
Yeah.
on use of force, or how are you training on implicit bias? So what are the answers that you're giving?
So we have had quite a few questions that have come in through our social media and through email. One of them about implicit bias and what kind of trainings do we have offered to our officers. Let me just read from our policy manual really quick. I knew this was going to come up, so I wanted to be prepared for it. As far as the training goes, let me answer that question first. That type of training in Utah has been a little bit hard to come by, and that's not to say that it hasn't been available, but those classes fill up quickly. But I'm assuming, and I'm sure that these types of trainings are going to be offered on a more regular basis to be able to get our officers into. But we do have policy that governs implicit bias and how officers treat members of the community. Let me just start by saying, and this comes from the straight from the implicit bias and training portion of our manual. It says the department is committed to providing law enforcement services to the community with due regard for the racial, cultural, and other differences of those served. It is the policy of this department, the Lone Peak Police Department, to provide law enforcement services and to enforce the law equally, fairly, objectively, and without discrimination toward any individual or group. It goes on to say every member of the department shall perform his or her duty in a fair and objective manner and as reasonable and is responsible for promptly reporting any suspected or known instances of based bias policing to any supervisor. Members should, when reasonable to do so, intervene to prevent any bias-based actions by another member of the department. So we're very aware of this, and this is something that we've talked about in the past, but obviously a little more recently as things have unfolded over the last couple of weeks. Ronell and I exchanged an email, and a couple emails over this last little bit, and it's upon the chief to hire principled officers who have integrity and that stand for something and that are looking out for every individual and not just what they see needs to be looked out for. So that's one question that we get, and we will be offering bias-based training as soon as we can find some. Now, I've asked Ronell if he'd come and speak to our officers, and I think he agreed that he would do that, and I'm really excited to have him come and speak to our entire department, because I think he's going to open some eyes. He certainly opened mine last week when we sat down and spoke.
So with respect to use of force.
So use of force, we there's let me bring that up really quick. So we have an entire policy that governs use of force, and there's a campaign right now that's an 8 Can't Wait campaign, and there are 8 policies that this group is campaigning that each department should adopt. And as we go through the use of force policy, we start checking those boxes one after another, you know, banning chokeholds or carotid chokeholds as a form of compliance. Those have been taken out of the policy. Those have been those are not allowed to be used in a use of force situation. We talk about a force continuum, and our policy talks about there's a force continuum if an officer is met with resistance at a certain level. These are the kind of, it needs to be met with an equal or less amount of force to be able to bring the individual into compliance or to take them into custody. There are many things that in our policy that talks about use of force and the way officers should conduct themselves. And our policy manual is on our website, and you can go there and you can read the entire policy manual there. And the law enforcement, in our policy manual, it's policy number 300. So for those of you that want to go take a look at it,
The website address is?
at lonepeakpolice.com. Thank you. That's good advertisement. You know, we've gotten a lot of questions about our body cameras, and a year ago we purchased the Axon body cameras for each one of our officers. They carry those when they're on duty, and the state law requires it and policy requires it anytime they have an interaction with any individual or member of the community that body camera is turned on. The state law governs when they can, and it's very limited when an officer can deactivate his body camera. And policy and state law go into that, but every interaction that law enforcement has with members of our community, it's on body camera. Now, as the police chief, I'm very grateful for it because it's been a good tool for me to go back, and if there's some training that an officer might need, we can talk about it. We can talk about the interaction that they might have, but it's also vindicated an officer when false claims come in, and we go back and we watch the camera and we watch the video camera, and what the resident or the citizen is saying occurred did not actually occur. So, and the officers, I think, are really liking these cameras. It's been a protection to them. It keeps both sides honest, to be truthful with you.
Yeah.
And so it's been a good tool for us. They weren't cheap, so we appreciate the residents being able or willing to help us to purchase those. So.
I remember the budget discussion.
Yeah, we did. We've also had, I've got a couple of things here. Yeah, those are the 3 that we've gotten a lot of questions about, are those 3 items.
So your policy manual is online?
Yes.
Use of force is item 300?
300, yep, it's under section 300. It's 300. You know, there's the 300's a long section, but 300 is the first one there. It talks about use of force.
Okay, awesome.
And if you go in and you compare the 8 Can't Wait campaign with our use of force policy, I think it addresses most of those, if not all of them. So there's a few of them that would need a little bit of explanation or interpretation, but they're there. So.
Awesome.
One thing I wanted to add to what he was saying, because when we spoke last week, I think, you know, it's all, for me, it's all either geographic or location specific, right? Like, I don't feel like I've been unfairly treated by a police officer here in where I live, right? And I think it's not the fact that, but I think it depends where you live, right? And I think last week when we spoke, I said it would be good for everybody, and we'll talk about materials that we have and things that you can go learn, but I had a friend of mine who's a really good friend of mine. He finally watched this documentary on Netflix called 13th. And if you watch that, you'll get a good snapshot for the Black community of how they see, and it's not law enforcement per se, but how, you know, the law in some ways has been used to weaponize law enforcement. And it's interesting how that you think about that way of thinking about it, right? And it's an interesting documentary to watch because it opens your eyes. And it's bipartisan, by the way, too. It's not like it's one side or the other. It's like both. And so it doesn't really matter. When you look at it, you might be saying, that's this. Like, no, it doesn't really matter. It's both sides of the aisle, right? And it opens your eyes to kind of seeing when you talk to somebody in the Black community, why they, you know, maybe have a thought or perspective around how they're treated by police officers. And again, it's not police officers like holistically. It's just there's pockets, and we all know there's pockets in all areas. So.
Awesome. Well, actually, our next question leads us to what we want to end this meeting with. And the question is, what kind of educational opportunities can we provide to help individuals learn about people of other backgrounds? So whoever did that, we owe you $5. And why don't we talk a little about, when we met last Thursday, we talked about a campaign slogan,
Thank you.
or a theme. And Ronell had T-shirts made.
I did.
For all of us
There's a medium.
deal with this. You know, learn.
And pass
We
those.
want to learn about other experiences.
I think the large is yours, right, over here. You can pass those other two over there.
Learn about other people's experiences, then internalize it in your heart, and then act. So,
Yeah.
thank you, Ronell, for
Yeah.
doing this. So we all got these nice T-shirts. In fact,
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Put mine on.
Well, and I think when when we talk about this, I think that's the important part. You can't just jump into this topic. 'Cause I know there's a lot of people who have energy, sometimes frustration, maybe like, well, what do I do? What can I do to really, impact change? And it really is about, you have to learn. And so, I work at Adobe, so I created this quick site. Hopefully we'll figure out a way to incorporate it into the city site so you can have access, but it has a lot of materials on it. And it's really about racial inclusivity. So going and learning about the history of racism is a place to start, right? And when you learn, the hope is that you then, as you're learning, you start, hopefully you'll step back and sit for a second and feel, what are you feeling? What are you feeling about what you've learned? What do you want to do differently? Because you can't be holistically prescribed what people do in their homes, but hopefully it's a process of education and then doing something about it. And the whole idea is then well, how do you act? I think that's another level we can talk about what we can do, because I think there's more that we can do with acting. My wife sold a bunch of quilts the other day and raised money, and we donated all of those funds to the Equal Justice Initiative, which if you haven't watched the movie Just Mercy, it's free on, I'm not advertising for it, but it's free, so you might as well watch it this month. It's on Warner Brothers offering for free to learn about Bryan Stevenson and what he's done in terms of, that initiative. But there's ways for you to act. Right, and I think there's a broader conversation we can have around what can we do actively too, outside of learning, to help improve the scenario in our community. Can you help in other communities too? There's a lot we actually probably can do outside of our community, where there's probably larger populations of Black people that live in Utah, and we can figure out that. I'm working with the Black Chamber of Commerce. I actually just joined them, and we'll be able to figure out what we can do to help in that regard too. But I think it's important that this kind of slogan in my mind has been something that we talked about, where it's you have to learn. Hopefully you feel something, or you hopefully you do, and then you have a desire to act, where you're put in the motion of okay, where do I get involved? Do I want to go donate? Do I want to sign a petition? Do I want to help educate your kids or family members or neighbors? What can you do then after that point?
So, Ronell, you've created a website that we will share when it's baked, when we feel like it's baked. It's a really nice job, and it has links to all kinds of podcasts, videos, books, other resources where you can learn about other people's experience in this domain.
Yep.
And then when we talked about this last week, you said that we were going to move forward on that, and you moved really fast. I mean, it was done really fast. I mean, you work for a company that might have some tools that enable that. Free advertising for Adobe, Spark is the tool. And then we talked about, maybe Nicki, you can talk about what we're thinking with respect to families in Highland and how we can leverage that.
Sure. Well, and I guess the background idea is it kind of came up when Ronell recognized, we can't change people's ideas. We can't change their hearts for them. And he doesn't want to, but if it were up to him, he would know where people lived, and he would stay away, because he doesn't want to force them. And so we kind of started thinking about how can we offer these things. Ronell's created this website already that has tons of information, and the library has a reading program, kind of in that same spirit of here's some activities and books to read, pick and choose what you want. And so we thought that something that everybody can do as soon as this website is up and running. We'd love to create, we have this program that we're going to release where families can pick and choose, go through the list of resources, the movies, the podcasts, there's children's books, there's young adult books, just to start having this conversation, because you know, we all believe strongly that you have to teach your children in the home. You know, you have to have those conversations. You know, the child that hurt your 6-year-old daughter's feelings, you know, that's a child that just hasn't had that conversation yet, and so we need to help them to do that. So the program is forthcoming. We will be doing it through Ronell's website that he's been working really hard on. And, you know, it may be that we have a sticker that families can earn, you know, that they can put in their window to show, we are of one family, one heart here in Highland or in Alpine if you guys want to do it. We're not totally sure because it's been a week and we're trying to wrap our brains around it, but the goal is to do more than lip service to this subject. The goal is to have something that families can do now. You know, it's in front of us right now and we don't want it to go away. We want to be changed and continue making progress together.
I think that's the critical point, is remaining engaged. Just continue.
Yeah.
And then we want inclusivity to be a Highland value and an Alpine community value. Right
Yes.
now, if people ask, what's a Highland value? You'd hear frequently, or even Alpine, family friendly. Well, inclusivity, we need to expand our family outside our home, outside our congregation, and include everybody, right? So, you know, if you're not a member of my faith, fine. You're a person, and I love you, and I want to help you. If you are of a different race, or a different ethnic background, that's okay. We love each other, and we want to help each other. So we're thinking that we can leverage this program to create that kind of a community feel and start to make a small change right here. And then that change propagates because we move, our kids move. I'll tell you, I grew up, and it was a little bit of a racist, it was racist where we lived in, and I had that. I was fearful of black people, and vice versa. But when my oldest son was in high school, unbeknownst to me, he joined the black student union. He was the only white guy that was in the black student union. And then they did a performance at high school in the gym, and he was out there dancing, and he had great moves with the rest of them. You know, they were his friends and brothers, and he went to their parties, and we had their parties at our house, and I go, wow. I may have grown up with a different environment, but my kids are way better than me because they're just not seeing it. And that just dawned on me just while we were talking. I hadn't thought about it in a long time. And that can happen here. We don't have to pass on biases that we have to our children if we work on it. And if they know that we're changing and that we want to change, they'll take their own path that's better than the one that we did.
Well, and oftentimes people, I've been getting a lot of emails, you need to pass a new law. And it's like, well, most of this stuff is already illegal, and making it super illegal doesn't change much. And, you know, like, it doesn't do much on that. And so, and then there's, people are saying, well, if we just had better laws, or if our system was better. And I think there are some problems, if you look at inequality or racism, that are bigger than any government, bigger than any system, and they're not solved by governments or systems. They are, you know, the governments and systems show the symptoms of those problems at times. But they're bigger than that, and they're not solved by what we consider macro solutions, which is changing the law or something like that. They're solved by micro solutions. And I know that sounds strange, but as I have these people sending me their email, I think to myself, is that where it ended for you? Is that email
threw it over
where
the
it
fence?
Because, you know, I'm going to do my best with the laws, but the solutions for all of this are, you know, pretty combative at times, and, you know, there's a lot of battles of ideas on how to solve these big issues, but ultimately they're really not solved in the state houses. They're solved in the homes of our community, and so that's really what we intended through this, is to start that process where we live and in our community, because that's how the big problems get solved. So,
And I think it goes beyond accepting and including. I think it goes to celebrating differences. I mean, it's really a different pattern of thought when you, hey, you're different, that's really cool, tell me about that. Or, you know, experience and celebrate cultural differences. I think it's what has made the country great, not to sound too idealistic, but it really is what our country is built on. And for us to separate ourselves from other groups and isolate ourselves is dividing ourselves, you know, and that's how we fall. Until we can celebrate our differences and embrace those differences, we really aren't reaching our potential as a community, as a country. And I mean, I had a unique experience when I had the reverse experience. So, and I think this helped me gain perspective in my life. When I was a missionary, I was sent to the Bronx, the South Bronx, to serve. And I ended up requesting extensions to my stay there, and the people I was working with requested those of the mission president, because I felt at home there. I mean, it took me a minute, but I started to feel like, hey, this is great. I actually really love working with the people here. I was definitely in the minority. And the culture was definitely different there than it was anywhere else that I'd experienced. But it gave me so many insights and the opportunity to embrace what other people thought and believed, and their differences were, in my mind, created strengths. And so I felt great about that. So when I came home to my white community that I returned home to, there are all these, you know, perceptions of other races that I just I said things in their defense to my family members who made these judgments, and would say, well, there's, you know, that's a different, there's some good ones, and I just said, look, you don't understand, because you've never lived in an environment where you're the minority, and they've had an opportunity, that the other group has had an opportunity to show you what they're all about. You've made these judgments, you've established your belief system completely devoid of personal experience. And it was really frustrating to me. And so I'm grateful to have had that opportunity, because I think it did change my perspective.
Yeah.
To your point, Brady, the education, it starts in the home. And when we can change our hearts in the home, we can pass that on to our children, and hopefully that mushrooms. And that starts by exposing ourselves to different cultures and different ideas. You know, the website that the Ronell's put together, there are so many resources on there. I started going through and I'm like, it's gonna take me a month or two to get through these. But they were there, the few videos that I watched and started to podcast, it's certainly changing the way that I view the world that I live in. And we need to put ourselves in situations where we are exposed to each other and different ideas to be able to bring ourselves together. Now, once we bring ourselves together, we have to get together around the table, all sides, and have those difficult conversations and uncomfortable conversations. And that's what I think is where things are going to start changing. When you feel something, this is a different feel now in society than I've ever felt. There's a revolution, if you will, truthfully, that I believe is moving, and for the better. And I think we need to get behind it. We need to gather everybody around the table that has input into this, that has something to offer, and make ourselves come out better on the other side. And I had a fantastic opportunity last Friday to attend a peaceful protest in Provo with my fellow chiefs and my counterparts in multiple jurisdictions throughout the county, where we were protesting police violence. You know, that's something that, you know, the comment was made, nobody hates a bad cop worse than a good cop, because we all get painted with that broad brush. And we need to make a change, and it starts by the leaders of the community, leaders in law enforcement, and leaders of the African American community to come together as one and say, okay, we've got a problem, how do we solve it? Yeah. But it only changes when we truly feel moved to do it. I have to change the way that I feel, and having part in this conversation and my experiences over the last 2 weeks have certainly moved me off my mark, and so we need to have that. We need to have that across the country. And so
we are out of time, but Nicki or Brady, is there anything you want to say as we wrap up?
You know,
I give Ronell the last
He's
word.
going to get the last word.
You know, I just want to thank Chief William. I don't know that I've ever met a police chief that is so humble, and I've appreciated so many of your comments and your
Thank you.
desire to listen and share some of your concerns. You know, our meeting that we had last week, you know, I was so grateful to have your leadership in our city, because I feel like you truly are trying to protect everyone, and you're trying to listen. And I only hope that everybody could have police leaders like that, and I'm really grateful for your humility
I can, I don't want to.
and your kindness.
Yeah, well, thank you. My counterparts in the county are, I think, much like I am, so.
You know, and I
yeah.
agree. I think our county police are excellent. We are really blessed with that.
Yeah. I would say briefly, there was a famous speech that Martin Luther King gave called "The Other America," and he gave it numerous times, but at Stanford was where that was his kind of the main one.
Mm-hmm.
And he, you know, I think a lot of people have been frustrated and appalled by the rioting and destruction and things that they see. But he talks about, you know, and he was no fan of rioting or any type of violence. He understood how it happened.
Mm-hmm.
But in that speech, he said, rioting is the language of the unheard. Okay? And he said, and the reason why you're hearing that language is because there are problems underneath it that are causing it. And the best way to prevent that kind of destruction and that kind of violence in our society is to get to the root of those problems before they become a language that the language of rioting that is spoken. You know, that I'm paraphrasing,
Yeah.
not as beautifully as he says it. But I think that, you know, and I think that it is important that we get to the bottom of things, and that's by giving humanity to others, not otherizing them, you know, and really really listening before it gets to the point of being the language of the unheard.
Yeah.
So now, before we wrap it up for us, I want to thank Aaron Wells, our Assistant City Administrator, who's been here monitoring YouTube, making sure it's working and showing questions, and Scott Hart, who is handling the video and doing this of his own free will with no financial remuneration. I very much appreciate their willingness to behind the scenes make this happen. And I want to thank your wife for being here and for supporting you and for making a wonderful family and being part of our wonderful Highland family. So we're now, let's have you wrap it up.
Yeah.
If we could.
Thank you everyone. Thank you for the conversation. I think it's been great, and I think this is a journey, right? I think it's not. We're starting today, right? I think it's interesting when we talk about what do we do next, and we have some ideas that we'll continue to roll out. But I think there's an opportunity that we have as a community in Alpine and Highland to really affect change. And I think we have an opportunity not just to affect it here, but also broadly, because you know those who live here may move on, our kids may go to other places, right? I think we have an opportunity to establish something that can really be an impact for greater good, whether it's locally or nationally, wherever it may be. I think we have an opportunity to be an example to the other communities around how do we come together. You know, this idea like that, it's interesting, we talk about color. People do see color, right? But we shouldn't be defined by a color. I think that's the distinction that we have to make. I think oftentimes we're like, yeah, I am black. You know, that's a part of who I am, right? But the idea that my color defines me as a certain type of person, that I have certain types of things that I do and how I treat people, is something that we have to really remove from our minds. And I think as we get uncomfortable, because again, the materials that you'll read, that you'll partake of, will probably make you uncomfortable. But the whole point of that is that you feel something. And that by feeling something, that will force you to actually think maybe differently and act in a way that will help make it better. And I think that's where the ultimate we want to get to. So thank you.
Thank you everyone. And thank you for joining us. Thank you, Troy. Big hugs.
COVID hugs.
Big hugs. No, I can hug Brady because he's had COVID. So.
And I must be immune, right?
But
So
thank
anyway,
you.
We'll continue this dialogue. We'll share with you our progress as
Yeah,
we
this
make
isn't
it.
the end.
No.
We're going to continue for a few months, maybe through the end of the year, maybe working with other cities that have more people of color that we can lift know, and you know, share some of the experiences, some of the materials that we grapple with, because some of the materials that are out there are going to be hard for us. They're things that we should grapple with, and you know, just gain more understanding and love for each other.
I think Ronell made a great point earlier that we're going to make mistakes. We're gonna blow it, right? But the act of trying and making sure that we're all putting in the effort to change the way we think and behave, I think, is really critical. Give ourselves a chance to fail.
Okay. So, as we wrap up, thank you for joining us. Share, if you watch this and found it productive, let your friends and neighbors know to watch this. This will be on our YouTube channel for a very long time. And we'll look forward to talking with you again later. Feel free to email any of us, please. We'll share the information on our websites and Facebook pages. So, again, thank you for joining us, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.